And now it's time for the William Malloch program. Mr. Malloch is former music director of KPFK, contributing editor to Musical America magazine, and Classical Music Awards panelist for the Grammys.
Thank you, Cindy Friedman. I have noticed now that the recording that I made a year and a half ago with some of the country's top period music instrumentalists of the 4 Bach suites, actually they're called overtures officially, but they're often known as suites, has started to show up in the shops. And so now I thought I'd try to give you somewhat more elaborate background, at least at the beginning, for why I went to the trouble of recording still yet one more presentation of Bach's orchestral suites, which are quite popular, though they're certainly not as popular as the Brandenburgs. And I think that part of the reason that they're not as popular is because they're not really played in the spirit in which the music was composed and in the spirit in which the music would have expected to be played at the time. I'll try to show you what I'm talking about by giving you a series of interlocking musical examples, but then hopefully we'll end up with the third suite. Now, as you know, if you've been listening to my program over the past 10 or 15 years, I deal a lot with tempo, and there's a good reason for that, because tempo is really the heart's blood of music, and to the extent that music does mirror the passions and idealized states of conduct of any one time, poetry aside, drama aside, it's really music where you actually can put your hand on the pulse of a time and the characters who populate that time, because music is characterization. We're always mirroring some kind of mood, some kind of attitude, some kind of philosophy. Music, strangely, though it's a wonderful discipline and a world unto itself, is at the same time, paradoxically, always about something other than itself. Of course, that other is a matter of endless dispute. But in the Baroque era, for instance, there was no doubt that people were attempting, for better or worse, to portray various moods and tempers. One thing that was true in Baroque music is that once you started in a certain mood, it was like the Greek unities, you pretty well were expected to go along in that vein until the end of the piece. This, for instance, is very different from what grew into the ideal for classical music that followed the classical era, where there was a unity of contrast, where you had what were often referred to as masculine and feminine ideas. But certainly, for whatever the words were, highly contrasting ideas, aggressive, passive. Usually a Baroque piece was devoted to one of those moods, as I say. Bearing that in mind, what if you distort the pace of a piece of music? Not that you can't play pieces of music at different tempos, but within the confines of a given time, there were archetypes, piece types. And though there was a fast end and a slow end and a middle to every tempo area that was appropriate for a piece of given character, it is possible in our time not to be sensitive to that key tempo range based upon the notes in the piece and put forward a character which has really nothing much to do with the spirit of the times that produced the music in the first place. There is a tendency for us to put off old music, to play it as if almost unconsciously played at a tempo which is slow. We tend to slow down old music, to make it old. It's a little bit psychological, too. We know that the sons like to, willy-nilly, in all innocence, progress at the expense of the fathers. They like to say that they can do it better, they can run faster, that they can hold their breath longer, or whatever. When Charles Rosen wrote about this, when you take a musical device from the past, or a piece from the past, there's a tendency to let it be less lively, less immediate, less nowish, less contemporary than the pieces of music which we produce now. This is certainly true in the popular field. And as the music gets older, it turns into nostalgia, and often the sharp edges are buffed off. Brad Kay has talked to me about this and has shown me, for instance, with the Beatles, how the vitality of that music is often compromised in remakes, when the Beatles music turns into elevator music, when the music of the 60s turns into airport music. The curious thing is, if you go back in time and try to find out what the original tempos were for music, for instance, in the Baroque era, and find that the tempo that we've been playing, the so-called old tempo, is really wrong, it turns out that the real old tempo very often is the new tempo. We're talking about the eternal now. When music is young, it has something in common with every music which is young. And curiously, as I tried to demonstrate in the collage, in the, I think it's the 9th piece in The Art of Fuguing, there's a community of musical gestures which spans generations, which goes right beyond the confines of any one arbitrarily arrived at historical period. Various kinds of musical gestures which you can find exist in the Renaissance, the Baroque, the Classical, the Romantic, and the Contemporary period. And sometimes we are blind to those unities because of the sometimes unconscious desire to make our new music shine by comparison with the old music. But as I say, when you get back and you find out what the tempos were of the old music, it was new. And it is, in a sense, perpetually new. Now, we certainly have a right to go back and try to experience the past, not as if it was yesterday, but as if it is today. And that's what intrigues me about this whole exploration. Then the question comes, well, how in the world are you going to find out what the tempo was of pieces of music in the past? Well, certainly, as I've tried to demonstrate on this program, if you go back before World War II and listen to records of music made from the early 1900s up to about 1944, they used to play music in a much more lively fashion and, generally speaking, much faster, much more much more with greater theatricality and less pompousness than classical music is often played today. Well, then, what happens when there weren't any records? Well, then you can go to piano rolls. And what if you have to go before there were piano rolls? And then you can get into this fascinating area when you find what you could call the first records, mechanical musical instruments, programmed to play music at the time of Mozart, Haydn, and Beethoven, and in fact mechanical instruments went all the way back to the 5th century. There are extant treatises in the Arab world telling how to build mechanical musical instrument that will reproduce music. Unfortunately, such instruments were destroyed long before our bombs would have had a chance to destroy them in the Baghdads of yesterday. But in Western Europe, some of those instruments still exist. And as you probably know, I made 2 trips to Europe where I tried to discover and record these instruments just to find out what I would find out about tempo. Now, since some of those instruments go at varying speeds, the instruments themselves won't tell us anything, but in coordination with other elements, we can kind of make a 3D picture of a time and its tempos. So beyond mechanical instruments, there are metronome marks. Before metronome marks, there are pendulum marks, like when you take a bullet and swing it at the end of a string and count how many swings per minute it takes, and then you can figure out how long the string has to be to make those swings take place at a certain rate. So you can have pendulum marks that are basically pre-metronomic metronome marks. And then beyond that, there are timings, and there's an amazing number of timings for pieces of music. I came across a catalog through a friend of mine called Arthur Ord-Hume, who's an expert in mechanical instruments in England and produces a magazine called Music and Automata, which is pretty fascinating. There was a catalog made for a wonderful machine organ for the Earl of Bute in 1762. There were 54 barrels lasting 12 minutes apiece, and on these barrels were 271 either pieces or sections of music, each one of which was individually timed. The barrels have long since disappeared. The machine was destroyed, but one copy of the catalog existed. And in fact, if Arthur Ord-Hume had not Xeroxed that one copy that he found in the British Library, we wouldn't even have that copy, because when the British Library moved to a different location, that's one of the books which was lost. And so the only thing that remains of it is this Xerox copy. But we have timings, as I say, for 271 pieces of music made in 1762 for the music of Handel, Vivaldi, Corelli, and the pendulum marks give us tempos for the music of Lully and his compatriots like Callas and others of his followers. That's very important because Lully created the French overture, what we know as the French overture, that piece which began his many operas, which were performed before King Louis XIV. and at which King Louis XIV danced, and at which the Parisian public would sing their favorite tunes as they appeared on the stage. Something much closer to a pop event than what we might think. And I'll get into that later. But one of the things that is obvious is if that is the lively quality of the aristocracy at that time, it's something that's not particularly evident to us most of the time. We, coming from a populist culture, have perhaps a magnified view of what aristocracy really was. In the 18th century, there was a strong element of medievalism in the culture. A king was a king. A postman was a postman. Everybody had his job to do. And therefore there was, more than we might realize, an easy intercourse under many circumstances between people of different classes. It's probably a little bit like things used to be in the American South between the blacks and the whites. There was, since if everybody knew his station, and he bloody well better have known his station, then there was a kind of a possibility of a certain kind of informal contact between people of different stations. Well, like Hamlet and the gravedigger, for instance. They had a good conversation, but still he was a prince and the gravedigger was a gravedigger. One of the things that happens in the French overture, which is the precedent for Bach's orchestral suites, which are based on Lully's overtures to his operas, and the dances which followed in the operas, which are all then packaged up into a nice concert suite. That's why there's the overture was called an overture, but the suites were the dances, and so there's been a heady conflict through the years as to whether to call the Bach overtures suites or the Bach suites overtures. But they all begin with a rather formal and pompous beginning. The music of the beginnings of the French overture, those musics are mirrored in pieces in Lully's time called entrées. They're entry pieces, and there's many an entree which just stands by itself. In the Lully overtures and in the Bach suites, there's always a lively fugal music, dance-like in character, which follows these introductions to the overtures. Such pieces have been timed and tempoed with the pendulum marks in the 1730s, and I'll give you some examples of that because the tempos at which these pieces are taken are frighteningly different than what we're used to when we hear performances of Lully overtures and Bach suites. When I was a kid and listened to the Bach suites, I always was very confused by these first movements because after the slow, pompous introduction representing the entree of the king or important or magical figures, we went into the allegro, so-called allegro. And then that music, that introductory music, would return. And when it returned, there was always a tremendous bump. Usually there was no unity of beat between the first part and the second part. And it seemed like you had a piece which began and then was continued with another piece, or a piece which continued and then was interrupted by another piece. There seemed to be very little organic relationship between the entry music and the fugal music which followed. When I got into my 30s and the LP era was here, and I had tape recorders at that time, I still do, but I had early tape recorders, I remember thinking, well, what if this music of the introduction to, say, Bach's Third Suite was to go at the same pulse rate, the same pace as the fugues which follow? What would that be like? Otto Klemperer had recorded the suites at that time, and Klemperer actually took the introductions at a pace which was almost literally half the pace of the following music. So by flipping the switch on the tape recorder, even though everything went up an octave higher, I could listen to that introductory music and see how it would go if it was basically at the same tempo as the fugal music which followed. And that seemed to make a certain kind of musical sense. Of course, as I say, everything was an octave higher. And not having a great deal of respect for my own opinion at that time, I thought, well, obviously, I must be wrong. This couldn't be. In spite of the fact that then looking at the music, I realized that there was no indication for what the tempo was at the beginning. And in fact, there was no indication for what the tempo was of the following fugal music. It was all up in the air. And if one read the music literally as it was, the actual bar lengths of the introduction and the actual quarter note values of the introduction were in fact the same. as the music which followed. So that would mean that you could play the whole thing in one tempo. Well, I put, as I say, all that aside and went on to other things. But when I stumbled across Bach's Art of the Fugue and began to realize that people had slowed that down so enormously and tried to rehabilitate the music with a colorful contemporary orchestration, and then when I was led to begin to collect things from the mechanical instruments, and I was particularly interested in minuets and how much faster they used to be played than the way they're played now, I did stumble across other things that related to this French overture. And I've tried to put them together now for you, and I'll try to share some of that material with you so you can see how I arrived at the conclusions I did for performing the Bach suites the way I did, and why I felt it was important enough to go to the trouble of actually making a recording to show all this. In Lully's opera, Atis, which is now recorded rather nicely by William Christie, complete on Harmonia Mundi, there is a scene where there's an entrée. It's called the Entrée des Songes Funestes, and that means the entry of the baleful dreams. Baleful is destructive and poisonous. I want to play you just an extract from the opening and then a little extract that comes later. Now, here's the way the music opens. That's played by Raymond Leppard in the English Chamber Orchestra, and that's the way we usually hear such music played today. You notice that there are dotted note passages in it, which are probably written dum, bum, 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 but in this case they're played bum, ba-bum, ba-bum. That was supposed to be the practice at the time in order to enliven such slow passages. There's no marking for the tempo on this, so tradition alone would have had to determine what that tempo was. Tradition and content looked at within the framework of that tradition. Now here's a descending scale passage, which comes first, I think, in the top and then is reflected in the bass, that we hear in many, many times in such pieces. It's sort of passively lyrical as we hear it played here. Just remember that idea in general. Now, let's jump over to a very similar, parallel kind of passage in the introduction to Bach's Third Suite, as played, just because it was the first one I grabbed, by Christopher Hogwood conducting the Academy of Ancient Music. Now, this is typical, again, of the way these introductions are uniformly played. There's a descending scale line which is related to the descending scale line we've just heard. Now, as I said earlier, there's no marking in Bach's Third Suite either as to what this tempo is supposed to be. No characterizing words like grave or longtime or adagio or anything like that. It's just the music. And it, too, in this performance has a certain amount of what they call overdotting or double dotting. The little notes after the big notes don't go bum, 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 but they go bum, ba-ba. So before we forget the first example, here's a parallel passage in Bach's Third Suite introduction. And later we'll hear that same idea performed in a far more rumbustious manner, and with the change of character that goes with such a change in pace. Now, before we forget those two, I want to play another parallel piece which is not active in texture, but it does have the dotted note sound, and the tempo is just about the same. Again, a traditional performance, in a sense you call it traditional, modern traditional, with Sir Adrian Boult and the London Philharmonic Orchestra. It's slow. It's about the same tempo as above, as I say, and it's the introduction to the Handel Organ Concerto, Opus 4, number 2. Now, in this performance, there is no overdotting, by the way, and so it'll make it a little clearer what I'm talking about. In other words, it doesn't go da, 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 but it goes da, da, da. In this case, Boult literally plays the music the way it's printed. Now that introductory music is followed by an allegro. I am not going to play you that allegro for reasons that will become clear later. I'm going to play another allegro from Handel's Organ Concerto Opus 4 number 5. It's archetypically very, very, very similar to the allegro which follows the introduction that I just did play. But I want to play that first, and then we'll come back to the music which we haven't heard, the music that actually follows this introduction in due course. Now again, this allegro is at a very conservative tempo. It relates generally proportionally to what we've already heard Boult play. So here's the allegro from the first movement of Handel's Organ Concerto, Opus 4, number 5, as Boult plays it. When I was in London in 1979, one of the very impressive machines I came across was called the Holland organ. It was made, as far as we know, by a man called John Holland, either in the late 18th or very early 19th century. And it used to be in the Colt Clavier collection, south of London. Mr. Colt has died, so I don't know what's happened to the machine. It probably, some foundation still operates there, and the machine is still there. And it plays the concerto from which the allegro you've just heard does come. It also happens that on the organ that I referred you to earlier, the Earl of Bute's organ, the one that has the catalog and that has the 271 pieces, this same concerto, number 5, is one of the pieces that is timed on the Bute barrels. And the timings were programmed by John Christopher Smith, who was Handel's assistant in Handel's old age and blindness. And so J.C. Smith knew Handel's way very, very well indeed. Smith's tempo for this movement is very much faster than the tempo that you heard Boult play it at. It is interesting to take John Holland's organ, which is a barrel organ, and which could be cranked at a variety of tempos, and cranking it so that the allegro, which you've just heard played by Boult, as it comes out on the Holland organ, will be played at the tempo prescribed for it by John Christopher Smith. This is how that piece sounds at Smith's tempo. As I said, the allegro which follows the introduction you heard Boult play belongs to the Organ Concerto Opus 4 number 2. Now that piece is practically indistinguishable from the one that you've just heard. It's archetypically very similar, and it is programmed on the barrels so that the spaces between the notes are precisely the same as on the one that you've just heard, so that the cranking speed would be literally the same. And so now let's hear what this other allegro sounds like from Handel's Concerto Opus 4 number 2, played at the J.C. Smith tempo for the Allegro from the Organ Concerto No. 5. Are you following me? Now, if we continue that cranking speed, so to speak, and shunt the barrel back to the very beginning, it's very interesting to see how that introduction, which you heard Bolt play, sounds if the cranking speed is the same as what we've just used for the Allegro which follows. And in these cases, I think that when it comes to Handel organ concertos, our country organist or deacon who was turning the crank for church services on the barrel organ would probably have cranked the barrel at the same speed throughout. And were he not to have done that, he wouldn't have had space to change the tempo anyway, because one piece follows immediately. So we can assume that these particular barrels, once the speed was set, were supposed to go at pretty much at one speed. Now, so that you have it all in mind, I'll briefly recap the intro as played by Bolt. Now we're going to hear that same intro at the derived tempo, cranking it at the same speed at which the following Allegro is played. That, again, is the Organ Concerto, Opus 4, number 2. And first we'll hear the intro, and then we'll hear the Allegro as we've already heard it, totally as a piece now. Now that tempo is just about somewhere between 108 and 112. Handel marks that movement a tempo ordinario, a staccato, which means at the usual tempo. On the Earl of Bute's barrels, quarter note pace for tempo ordinario, remember the one you've just heard went about between 108 and 112. The quarter note pulse for tempo ordinario falls somewhere between 84 and 116 on the metronome mark. So this pace is just about right in the middle. Very ordinary, in other words. Now, bearing all that in mind, let's now go to an introduction from the overture in D major from George Philip Telemann's Toffel music. This is the introduction to the first movement, and it's marked lentement, which means slowly. It is, in this performance by Nicholas Harnoncourt and the Concentus Musicus of Vienna, at the same slow tempo as the early examples which we heard when I first began to show you how these introductions are usually played. Now you're going to hear that same descending idea come in this piece that we already heard earlier in the other pieces. Here it comes. Now we're we're going to hear a lyrical second idea, and try to remember this idea, this one. Handel and Telemann were good friends. Telemann lived in Hamburg, Handel lived in London, and they corresponded. And Handel sent Telemann plants from England, which he could not get in Hamburg, and which he adored, and he was very grateful to Handel for having sent him those plants. And in return, he sent Handel a bound copy of his brand new masterpiece, the Tafelmusik, table music, which included several overtures, or suites. Well, Handel took that Tafelmusik and he kind of repotted it. Handel was known as something of a thief. So for plants, he got music and he used it. He incorporated that lyrical second idea, dee-da-da-da, which we heard at that pace, into a chorus from his oratorio Hercules, which is called Crown with Festal Pomp, both played by the orchestra and sung by the chorus. Now it so happens that this particular chorus also happens to be on the Butte Barrels. Its tempo, 100. So now let's hear this Handel chorus, which incorporates that da-da-da-da at a very much more lively pace. Crown with Festal Pomp from his oratorio Hercules, at J.C. Smith's tempo. There it is. Again. Now I want to lead you into the notion that tempo words in the Baroque era, and in all of music, are not scientific quantities. Certainly in the classical period and much of the Romantic period, as well as the Baroque period, they had more to do with mood and sentiment than an actual pulse. For instance, Telemann's Tafelmusik overture is marked, as I said, lentement, slowly. The tempo for Handel's piece, his chorus, is allegro ma non presto. You could say fast, but not too fast. What am I going to do, class? The obvious thing. I'm going to now play you the Telemann Tafelmusik at Handel's tempo. And let's see what this music sounds like at this much more lively tempo, which we've just heard for Handel's chorus from Hercules as set by J.C. Smith. Here's the Telemann piece at J.C. Smith's tempo for the Handel chorus. I mentioned that the lentement had more to do with the character, perhaps, than the actual pace. But another way of looking at it is the basic beat for this music. Dum, ti-da-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum, ti-da-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum. Or is it dum, ti-da-dum, ta-dum, ta-dum, ti-da-dum, ta-dum, ta-ta-ta. See? We can have a slow beat and a fast beat going on at the same time. And in the Baroque era, they used big beats. That's a carryover from the early choral music when the tactus was in force. And in later music, very often the bar line was the basic beat. And those beats were, as I say, the underlying ones, or you could call them the overlying ones. They were the fundamental pulse, which a lot of notes could be divided and put into that fundamental pulse. But they were long and strong. You remember perhaps the story of Lully, who set the beat at the beginning of one of his operas late in life by using a great cane. Unfortunately, the cane had a pointed edge on it, and as he beat it like that, he stuck it right into his foot and caused great problems. Gangrene came. He was too proud to have the foot amputated, and so he died as a result of his giving the big beat with the big cane. So longtime may simply mean a slow, big beat, the beat that's supposed to be felt for music of this kind, instead of a faster beat, or even faster. So we're beginning to come up with some evidence, arrived at variously, that these introductions were faster than the way they're usually played these days. And so armed with that much information, let's now go forward. We'll actually go backward. We'll go now to the Lully piece, which I began with as the first example, the Entrée des Songes Funestes from Otis. But let's play it now at the tempo specified by Louis-Léon Pajot, who was the Count d'Ensembles. He invented a machine called the metrometre, the metrometer, which is basically a pendulum device. And in 1732, he presented his findings before the Royal Academy of Sciences in Paris. And all this information is published and available in the Bibliothèque Nationale and in many other places. He turned in some examples of pieces with recommended tempos, and this particular piece was one of them. And he asks for a tempo which is the equivalent of quarter note 114, and it's very close indeed to the tempo of the Telemann Overture, which we've just heard. It'll still, again, be in two sections. The first one is the introduction. It's overdotted, and at this tempo, it really packs it in, because the only way I can show you these things is to speed up the tape recorder. It appears to me already that the overdotting that's used in this Lully piece is not really as necessary as it was at the slower tempo. Let me give you this first example now at the Count Léon Pajot's tempo. Now here's that descending scale passage, which is much more active now than the kind of passively lyrical way that it had. And also those notes in the first that went da-da-da-dum, da-da-da-dum, now could go, as written, da-ta-ta-ta-ta, ta-ta-ta-ta, because they wouldn't drag as much. In any case, if you were to crimp them up, you wouldn't have to crimp them up quite as much as the performers have been forced to do because of mechanics. And the example that I've just played you that goes considerably faster than the way it was actually recorded. But now, just to have in mind a common element in all these things, let's listen to this descending scale passage which comes later in the piece at, again, the new tempo, that is to say, the old tempo. To do now is give you an example of the overture by Bach, the very beginning of the Suite number 3 in D major, which I also earlier played for you following this Entrée des Songes Funestes. And now I want to play it at that tempo, which you've just basically heard. It's actually quarter note equals 112. Here, because of the liveliness of the tempo, the overdotting is unnecessary. And notice you'll hear the descending scale passage and a rumbunctiously active bass line. This is what I conducted with a group which we dubbed the Boston Early Music Soloists. And then it repeats, and you'll hear it complete later. Well, you see that at this pace, the music kind of overdots itself, because when you go ta-tum, 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 you're going to be just enliven the music, you're going to go ta-tum, 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 a little faster. And the ta-ta-ta-ta sounds fine as it is, and bum-ba sounds fine as it is, so that you have this interplay of rhythmic values. If you play it at this tempo, which I think is the right tempo, the music, and including the overdotting, kind of takes care of itself. I would like to recapitulate now for you this very same passage, as we heard it before, and we'll hear it again now, with Hogwood at the slow tempo. And notice what happens when we go right into the so-called allegro, from slow introduction to allegro, because I wanted you to see this tremendous bump I was talking about, which I couldn't stand, when there's a sudden change of pace, texture, and mood. And I always felt rather peculiar about this, but particularly when the music comes back into the slow music. But again, for your purposes of comparison, let's hear Hogwood at the slow way going into the so-called fugal allegro from the first movement of Bach's Third Suite. See, there's no relation between one tempo and the other. As I say, to me it sounds like the first half of one piece of music followed by the second half of another piece of music. This is particularly important because, although it's changing now, we've been accustomed to hearing these overtures played in three-part form, when in fact they were written in five-part form. We usually hear them A, the introduction, B, the lively fugal music, returning to a composed recapitulation of A, which is not quite the same, so we call it A prime. But in fact, if you play it the way it was written, you go from A, introduction, to B, fugal passage, to A prime, recap of introduction, to B again, and then to A double prime. So we have music in five-part form. And if you maintain a continuity of tempo between one section and another, one music goes very naturally into the other. Now, my allegro is slightly slower than Hogwood's, and the reason for that is because the introduction is considerably faster. So what you need to do is find a good compromise pace where both sections work. And I'll try to show you how you have a much more seamless quality as you go from one to the other. We'll now go from, in my recording, from the latter part of the allegro, which we just fell into with Hogwood, into a recapitulation of the introduction, and then back into the allegro, so-called allegro again, all at the same unified pace. seen a number of examples of the introductory music to the overtures of Lully and Bach's time going at a pace much faster than what we're used to. And those paces have been variously marked. Let's see, a tempo ordinario, lentiment, allegro ma non presto, yet they've all been the same tempo. So again, the words, they're relative matters. They depend upon the context, and very often they simply describe the mood of a piece, not the pace. Eventually, I'm going to play you the whole third suite, but I want to play you what is really a bizarre example of what I'm talking about before that. In Lully's Per se, there's a section called the Entrée des Divinités Infernales, the entrance of the infernal divinities. This is the way it's played by Raymond Leppard in the English Chamber Orchestra, and the particular passage does have a marking, and the marking is gravement, very gravely. I played the complete piece for you for reasons which will be obvious. As I say, it's marked gravement, gravely. Now here again, Louis-Léon Pajot, the Count d'Onzembre, gives us a tempo for this particular piece. It's in his list. And what he asks for is the equivalent of dotted quarter note equals 100. And let's see, that's this. So, but the tempo that he asks for is just about twice as fast as what Leppard gives us. It's basically, because of its rhythm, it's a little remindful of the kind of rhythm that Beethoven comes up with in the first movement of his Seventh Symphony, and it's just about at Beethoven's tempo, which is 104, just a little bit faster. So here we go with the gravement at d'Onzembre's tempo. And that's all you get. And it's over. Very mirthful gravity. And yet, what does gravement mean? Does it mean maybe the big beat again? Da 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 dun da 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 dun da da dun da da dun da da. Whatever it means, gravement has to be taken with a grain of salt. Gravement does not give you a tempo. It probably has to be looked at in terms of what precedes and what follows. But the words are not to be paid attention to. Only my words now are to be paid attention to. Now, I want to tell you that this is the William Malloch program, and this is KPFK Los Angeles. We'll have a special feed from Washington as usual at 1:30, but we have time to play you the complete third suite as I recorded it. You certainly heard enough comments about the overture, and you know what to expect, and you know that you're going to hear it in 5-part form. There's ample evidence to indicate that Bach, when he wrote these suites, expected them to be played one on a part. Not that he wouldn't have been happy, as other composers have been, to hear his music played by a larger ensemble, perhaps for festival purposes, but for every day it was composed one on a part. It's very interesting when you record it that way because it varies between chamber music and orchestral music. There are times when it sounds like orchestra music and there are times when it sounds like chamber music. There is doubling in the way Bach scores it. Very often the oboes play the same things that the violins are playing. And when they do, because especially in this suite there are trumpets and drums, it sounds like a very big ensemble, but I can guarantee you that at any one time there's no more than 13 people playing in this recording. Bach did it for reasons of economy and, of course, authenticity, and I did it for the same reasons. After the overture to the overture, we hear the famous air, known as the air for the G string, among other things. And I tried not to let it go at a lugubrious pace. My feeling of it was that Bach takes a stroll. He's happy under God's heaven, and he simply takes the air, so to speak. And you'll notice that the tempo for the air kind of comes out of the tempo for the overture. And the tempo for the following gavottes 1 and 2, which are interlinked, kind of comes out of the tempo of the air. And the tempo of the bourrée sort of comes out of the tempo of the preceding gavottes 1 and 2. And finally, so does the tempo of the gigue, which I looked upon more as a real jig, and it's taken as a jig-like tempo. There are plenty of examples on the Earl of Bute's barrels and in other sources for the fact that jigs could go very, very, very fast indeed. And I noticed the tempo of one piece very often kind of sprang out of the tempo of the preceding one, and that the real contrast in pieces, as I've tried to say now, is not so much a new beat, but a contrast in texture, so that out of the old beat, the relationships being completely different, you hear these wonderful, joyful changes, the flowering out of one piece from the piece which precedes it. You hear that kind of thing still, for the art goes on in popular music, and particularly in jazz, where sections will go into double time suddenly, or into half time suddenly, or into a related time. Very often there's a beat connection. Certainly in discos, places used for dancing, the tempo of one piece will be pretty much the tempo of the preceding piece. Of course, in the Baroque pieces, there's more variety of texture than there are often in things that you hear in discos. But now let me please play for you the Boston early music soloists under my direction on the Koch International label in the complete, as annotated, Suite Number 3 in D major by Bach. You've heard One on a Part, complete with all repeats, Bach's Overture or Suite number 3 in D major. The performers were the Boston Early Music soloists, and I, William Malloch, was their musical director and conductor. And there are a bunch of very fine people and some of the country's very best period instruments performers, and they were Daniel Stepner on the first violin, Linda Kwan on the second violin, Laura Jeppesen on viola, Laura Bluestein, cello, Thomas Coleman, bass. The harpsichord was played by Francis Conover Fitch. Oboe 1 was Stephen Hammer. Oboe 2 was Mark Shackman. The bassoon was Dennis Godburn. First trumpet was Dennis Ferry, of the Swiss Romande Orchestra, by the way. Second trumpet was a young Canadian called John Thiessen, and trumpet 3 was a Bostonian called Fred Holmgren. The timpani, made after Baroque models by the timpanist, were played by Ben Harms. That's one of 4 suites, which are all now for the first time in recorded history, complete with all repeats, on one compact disc. The company releasing it is Koch International. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll bring you more on the other 3 suites as time goes on. But since it's now at last seems to be available, I thought it was time to bring it to you in depth, and I hope you liked the introduction and could understand what I was talking about. I tried to be clear. Sorry there isn't time for phone calls, but some other time. Bye-bye. Thank you.